January 15th, 2026, Marco Rubio's confirmation hearing. The son of Cuban immigrants becomes Secretary of State with a singular mission: regime change in Cuba, not as unfortunate byproduct of sanctions, not as hoped for consequence of pressure, but as explicit policy objective. He links Cuba policy to Chinese hemispheric containment. He articulates a vision that subordinates diplomacy to ideological confrontation, and he bets that Venezuela's collapse creates a strategic window for maximum pressure to finally work, despite 6 decades of evidence suggesting otherwise. This is the story of how Marco Rubio, a politician whose entire identity centers on Cuban-American anti-communism, became the architect of a policy that treats 11 million people as acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of ideological transformation. It's the story of whether maximum pressure can force regime change when 6 decades of comprehensive embargo could not. And it's the story of what empirical evidence about sanctions' effectiveness actually tells us versus what administration officials claim will happen. Let's examine the Rubio doctrine, its strategic logic, its empirical precedents, and what the evidence reveals about whether this gamble will work. Marco Rubio didn't just adopt Cuban regime change as a policy position, it's the foundation of his entire political identity. Son of Cuban immigrants who left before the revolution, he entered Florida politics in the late 1990s with Cuba policy as defining issue. His 2010 Senate campaign centered on hardline anti-communism. His 2016 presidential bid positioned him as the anti-Obama on Cuba engagement. For 30 years, every major foreign policy stance, every legislative priority, every campaign message has connected back to one objective: ending the Cuban Revolution. During his January 15th confirmation hearing, Rubio didn't hedge. He stated explicitly that whilst the administration wouldn't make regime change happen, there's no doubt about the fact that it would be a great benefit to the United States if Cuba was no longer governed by an autocratic regime. He referenced the Helms-Burton Act, which codifies the embargo into law and requires regime change before sanctions can be lifted, as the legal framework constraining any negotiation. He linked Cuba policy to Chinese hemispheric containment, characterizing Havana as part of systematic challenge to US hegemony. Rubio occupies unique position within the Trump administration, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor level access. This dual role gives him extraordinary influence. Trump's instinct favors deals and declarations of victory. Rubio's ideology demands regime transformation. The tension creates strategic ambiguity. Trump states, "I think we're going to make a deal with Cuba," whilst Rubio insists on institutional dissolution. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez characterized this as Rubio pursuing personal agenda that subordinates Trump's deal-making to ideological confrontation. Here's what appears to have convinced Rubio and the administration that maximum pressure works. On January 3rd, 2026, US Delta Force conducted a military raid capturing Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Within weeks, Venezuela's political transition appeared to vindicate the hardline approach. But here's what the evidence actually shows. Venezuela's sanctions accelerated Chinese and Russian integration, degraded US strategic position, and didn't produce regime change. Military intervention did. The patron-client relationship between Venezuela and Cuba collapsed not because sanctions worked, but because US military force removed Maduro. Yet the administration appears to have concluded that maximum pressure caused Venezuela's transformation, and therefore the same strategy will work in Cuba. The Venezuela precedent deserves forensic examination because it's the strategic model underpinning current Cuba policy. During Trump's first term, the administration implemented comprehensive maximum pressure on Venezuela. Oil sector sanctions cutting off revenue, financial system targeting, preventing dollar transactions, asset seizures blocking government access to foreign reserves, and diplomatic isolation attempting to fracture Maduro's international support. The stated objective: force Maduro's capitulation or removal by depriving the regime of critical resources. Administration officials predicted that cutting off oil revenue would collapse Maduro's ability to pay military and security forces, triggering elite defection and regime fracture. They anticipated that humanitarian suffering would mobilize popular uprisings. They expected that international pressure would isolate Venezuela, preventing alternative economic partnerships. The theory: comprehensive sanctions create conditions where regime survival becomes impossible. forcing either capitulation or internal coup. A 2026 Atlantic Council analysis concluded that maximum pressure was a gift to China, Russia, and Iran. Here's what occurred. When Western oil companies were forced to exit Venezuela through license revocations, Chinese and Russian firms rapidly acquired the abandoned stakes and relationships. Iranian companies supplied diluent necessary for Venezuelan crude production after US sanctions prevented acquisition from traditional suppliers. Venezuelan regime rerouted oil sales through non-Western intermediaries, accepting lower prices from Chinese and Russian purchasers. The net effect: US strategic position degraded, adversary influence increased, and Western economic leverage disappeared. Congressional Research Service analysis documented that Venezuela sanctions reduced crude production. Venezuelan output fell from 2.8 million barrels per day in 2013 to under 800,000 barrels per day by 2024. Production decline was real. But this reduction did not translate into policy concessions from Maduro. Instead, the regime consolidated power, strengthened security apparatus control, and adapted to operating under comprehensive pressure. The humanitarian cost was catastrophic. Widespread malnutrition, healthcare system collapse, mass emigration of over 7 million Venezuelans, but the regime sustained itself. On January 3, 2026, US Delta Force conducted a military raid capturing Maduro, not sanctions-induced elite defection, not popular uprising triggered by economic pressure, not negotiated settlement, military intervention. The Venezuela precedent the administration cites as validating maximum pressure actually demonstrates that sanctions didn't produce regime change, military force did. If the lesson from Venezuela is that sanctions don't work without military force, then the Cuba strategy rests on false precedent, unless the administration intends similar military intervention, which creates entirely different strategic calculations and risks. So the Venezuela case study reveals how maximum pressure can achieve outcomes opposite to stated objectives. But Venezuela represents just one data point. What does the broader historical record, decades of sanctions cases across multiple continents, actually demonstrate about sanctions' effectiveness in achieving regime change? A 2014 European Journal of Political Research study examined when sanctions strengthen versus weaken authoritarian regimes. The findings: sanctions strengthen authoritarian rule if the regime possesses strong claims to legitimacy and maintains limited economic linkages to the sanctioning power. Under these conditions, sanctions trigger rally-around-the-flag effects. External pressure mobilizes nationalist sentiment, allowing leaders to justify repression as protection against foreign aggression, and populations tolerate hardship as patriotic sacrifice. The Castro regime possesses substantial legitimacy claims rooted in nationalist mythology about resisting US intervention. The Bay of Pigs, multiple assassination attempts, 67 years of embargo. And Cuba's economy has been substantially delinked from the United States for 6 decades, meaning additional sanctions impose costs but don't represent systemic shocks. The empirical research suggests Cuba represents precisely the regime type that sanctions strengthen rather than weaken. Academic consensus holds that comprehensive international sanctions, combined with internal resistance, contributed to apartheid's end in South Africa. Nelson Mandela stated in 1993 that there is no doubt sanctions helped. But South Africa's case differs from Cuba in multiple critical respects. South Africa possessed deep Western economic integration, making sanctions economically devastating. South Africa had contested domestic legitimacy with organized internal opposition, and South Africa faced unified international pressure, including from traditional allies. Cuba has none of these characteristics. UN sanctions on Iraq from 1990 to 2003, intended to prevent weapons of mass destruction, reassembly inadvertently killed hundreds of thousands of civilians through humanitarian deprivation. Meanwhile, Saddam Hussein consolidated power, extracted $11 billion through sanctions evasion schemes, and maintained regime control throughout. The sanctions produced mass suffering without achieving stated objectives, and ultimately required military invasion to remove Hussein. North Korea represents the ultimate test case: comprehensive sanctions for 6 decades, near total international isolation, catastrophic humanitarian conditions including periodic famines, yet the regime has not collapsed, has not liberalized, and has continued nuclear weapons development. If maximum pressure couldn't force North Korean regime change despite conditions far more extreme than Cuba currently faces, what evidence suggests it will work in Havana? Academic analysis examining sanctions' effectiveness concluded that sanctions have historically failed to achieve US foreign policy goals when examined empirically. Research indicates economic sanctions worsen prospects for democracy in targeted countries and mobilize regimes' core supporters against foreign interloper. Instead of producing political change, sanctions often serve authoritarian leaders' political interests by allowing them to externalize responsibility for economic failure. Regime officials blame external enemies rather than internal mismanagement. Helms-Burton specifies that a transitional government must meet specific criteria before meaningful sanctions relief. First, legalize all political activity. Second, release all political prisoners and allow international prison inspections. Third, dissolve the State Security Department. Fourth, dismantle committees for defense of the revolution. Fifth, dissolve rapid response brigades. Sixth, publicly commit to free and fair elections within 18 months that exclude Fidel and Raúl Castro from government. Let's examine what each requirement actually means for regime survival. The State Security Department constitutes the regime's internal security apparatus, its capacity for political repression, surveillance, and coercion. Dissolving it eliminates organizational infrastructure for maintaining authoritarian control. The Committees for Defense of the Revolution represent neighborhood-level surveillance networks integrating millions of Cubans into regime security structure. Dismantling CDRs undermines the regime's grassroots social control mechanisms. Excluding Castro's from government requires dynastic political retirement. Whilst Fidel died in 2018, Raúl remains alive and reportedly maintains influence over military and security leadership. No authoritarian regime can dissolve its security apparatus, dismantle surveillance networks, and exclude founding leadership whilst maintaining power. These requirements don't represent incremental reforms. They're demands for regime self-liquidation. A Cuban government that dissolved state security and dismantled CDRs would have eliminated the organizational capacity to prevent opposition movements from organizing, would have no mechanism to suppress protests, and would face immediate challenges to Communist Party monopoly control. Economic desperation, political repression, humanitarian crisis. If conditions become sufficiently catastrophic, deterrence messaging might fail because perceived risk of staying exceeds perceived risk of crossing. Maximum pressure, creating humanitarian catastrophe, could generate migration push factors that overwhelm deterrence. The Trump administration moved to eliminate the CHNV parole program in 2026, closing legal pathways while simultaneously intensifying conditions that create migration pressure. Mass Cuban migration doesn't affect abstract geopolitical interests. It affects Marco Rubio's home state and electoral base. Cuban-American voters in South Florida represent critical bloc in ultimate swing state. If maximum pressure triggers uncontrolled migration surge that overwhelms Florida communities, creates humanitarian crisis in Miami-Dade, and generates images of Coast Guard turning back desperate refugees, the political optics become catastrophic for the very constituency Rubio represents. So migration represents both humanitarian consequence and strategic constraint. But there's an even darker scenario. What if rapid regime collapse produces not orderly democratic transition, but state failure? What happens when ungoverned territory 90 miles from Florida becomes available to transnational criminal organizations? Haiti provides cautionary precedent for what state failure looks like in Caribbean context. Gangs control Port-au-Prince. Security forces have collapsed. Humanitarian catastrophe produces mass displacement. International intervention has failed to restore order. Haiti represents not temporary instability but sustained state fragmentation, where criminal organizations exercise territorial control and legitimate governance has disappeared. Cuba sits astride major drug trafficking routes between South American cocaine production zones and North American consumption markets. Geographic position makes the island strategically valuable for transshipment. Currently, Cuban law enforcement maintains counter-narcotics cooperation with US Coast Guard, but state collapse eliminates that cooperation and creates ungoverned spaces. Maximum pressure objectives include dissolving state security department and dismantling security apparatus. But if regime collapses rapidly rather than through managed transition, security force dissolution might mean not democratic control but institutional vacuum. Former security personnel trained in intelligence, surveillance, coercion become available for recruitment by highest bidder. Mexican and Colombian cartels possess resources to recruit Cuban ex-security forces for trafficking operations. Imagine this sequence. Maximum pressure creates humanitarian catastrophe. Regime collapses rapidly from elite fracture or popular uprising. Security apparatus dissolves without successor institutions ready. Economic collapse accelerates as remaining state capacity disappears. Mass migration overwhelms Coast Guard interdiction. Cartels exploit ungoverned territory to establish trafficking infrastructure. Suddenly the US faces simultaneous migration crisis, drug trafficking surge, and potential need for military intervention to prevent criminal organization territorial control, all within 90 miles of Florida. Unilateral sanctions work when target country is economically integrated with sanctioning power and lacks alternative partners. Cuba is already delinked from US economy, 6 decades of embargo. An international coalition refuses to enforce US demands. EU actively opposes extraterritorial enforcement. Canada maintains independent policy. Mexico provides symbolic support but no oil. China and Russia offer limited aid without decisive commitment. This coalition fracture creates sanctions evasion pathways and enforcement challenges. The empirical record suggests low probability for sanctions-induced regime change. But low probability isn't zero probability, and Cuba's specific circumstances might represent exceptional case rather than typical pattern. Futures don't announce themselves in advance. What we can do is map possible pathways, weight their probability based on historical precedent and Cuba-specific factors, and acknowledge what remains genuinely unknowable. Russia, China, Mexico could stabilize minimal oil supply sufficient to prevent total grid collapse. This buys time for negotiations. Facing unsustainable humanitarian catastrophe, Cuba accepts partial reforms, economic liberalization, political prisoner releases, foreign policy distancing. In exchange, Trump administration suspends tariffs, allows limited sanctions relief. Regime survives. Trump claims victory. Humanitarian crisis stabilizes. Trump's transactional instincts favor deals he can claim as wins. But Helms-Burton requires institutional dissolution, not incremental reforms. Rubio and congressional hardliners might block any settlement short of regime change. Historical precedent suggests authoritarian regimes sometimes accept limited reforms under pressure, but Helms-Burton's statutory requirements and Rubio's ideological commitment create higher barriers than typical negotiation scenarios. Cuba survived a 1990s special period. GDP contracted 35%, blackouts routine, food rationing intensified. Regime endured through repression, emigration draining dissidents, and eventual partial recovery. North Korea sustained totalitarianism through 6 decades of comprehensive pressure. Authoritarian regimes can sustain extraordinary hardship if security forces remain loyal and populations lack alternatives. The Trump administration's 2026 escalation of Cuba sanctions represents a calculated bet that political circumstances have shifted sufficiently to enable regime change through economic coercion. Marco Rubio's emergence as dominant voice in US foreign policy, combined with political influence of Florida-based Cuban-American representatives, has shifted policy towards explicit regime change objectives. However, the strategy faces multiple empirical, legal and diplomatic constraints, suggesting that maximum pressure is more likely to produce humanitarian catastrophe, mass irregular migration, regional instability, and potentially failed state conditions than democratic transition. Historical precedent indicates that comprehensive sanctions rarely achieve democratization objectives and often entrench authoritarian rule. Cuba's 6 decades of economic delinkage from the United States means additional sanctions impose costs on ordinary Cubans whilst preserving regime survival mechanisms. The Rubio doctrine rests on the Venezuela precedent, but what did maximum pressure on Venezuela actually achieve versus what advocates claim it achieved? Sanctions accelerated adversary integration. Military intervention removed Maduro. The patron-client relationship collapsed because the patron got arrested by special operations forces not because maximum pressure created conditions for regime transformation. Marco Rubio bet that maximum pressure can achieve what 6 decades of comprehensive embargo could not: regime change in Cuba through economic coercion alone. The empirical record suggests overwhelming skepticism. The strategic logic reveals multiple constraints. The humanitarian cost is already materializing. But genuine uncertainty remains about which pathway Cuba takes from here.